Hi, I'm Noah Gervais. In this video we're going to be looking at two classic first-person games, Duke Nukem 3D and Deus Ex. We're going to be examining the elements that made these games such classics in the first place, and then we're going to be taking a look at the decade-later sequels that both games got. We're going to be seeing how the modern games stack up against the standards set by the originals, but we'll also be comparing how they are against each other. Human Revolution was a major success that took the skeleton of the original game and built and innovated upon it, but Duke Nukem Forever took what was great about Duke Nukem 3D and just flushed it down the tubes. Both games had big budgets, both games had great ambition, so why did one game become so successful where the other game fell so unbelievably short of everyone's expectations? In this video, we're going to be taking a look at why. Let's start with Duke Nukem 3D. It's the third in the series, the first two being very early platformers, but Duke 3D was a totally new deal at its release, and its presentation is absolutely peerless. Duke Nukem 3D was the most gleefully violent game yet made when it came out. Doom and Wolfenstein have a sense of humor, but Duke Nukem 3D is a non-stop parade of bullets and jokes until the very end. The plot is pretty much summed up in the game's first line, "You alien bastards are going to pay for shooting up my ride," which seems reasonable, and then you do it. Duke 3D doesn't need a plot, as it has some of the most charismatic level design and memorable art and sound direction in 90s gaming. Years later, when they trot out someone on Fox News to talk about unapologetic violence in games, Duke 3D is still what they're seeing in their mind's eye. When the game came out, this was a big deal. It's easy to forget in a market absolutely saturated in comedy shooters like Bulletstorm that there was a time when this was a subgenre that had to be invented. This game invented it. Let's talk about why the legacy of Duke 3D is felt so strongly even today. First and foremost is level design. Like Doom, Duke 3D's levels were short, about 7 to 15 minutes a pop for casual play, but unlike Doom's sci-fi labyrinths, most Duke levels were real-life inspired places, like a supermarket, a prison, a strip club. Most of the levels had a certain plausibility of art direction to them that made the cartoon violence that erupts throughout seem somehow even wackier. The levels are also filled, in a way I haven't really seen strongly represented in years, with secret areas only accessible through messing with the level, sticking your nose into every nook, and compulsively hitting the use key whenever you see something new. The shortness of the levels, the quickness and bloodiness of combat, the potential for hidden rewards everywhere you go, all of it accumulates into a gameplay experience that feels like anything at all could happen, and probably would. Duke 3D is a world that feels truly vibrant and clever, a cleverness of construction that makes the stupidity of the player character even more hilarious. Duke Nukem is a terrible, terrible idea for a character that works brilliantly within the context of the game. Duke is the ideal form of every action movie cliché possible, a one-man The Expendables. And that's one of the reasons why he worked so well in Duke 3D. Gaming barely had a history to go back and reference, so almost all the jokes are drawn from either movies or from the game environment. Often they're pretty much perfect. The levels are chock full of great references and awful puns, in addition to having well-considered layouts and through paths. The highly stylized enemy and weapon designs further contribute to the no-top-to-be-over feeling. And there's the beer and tits angle. Old Duke loves himself some beer and some tits, and since women gamers weren't really a thing people considered back in the 90s, 3D Realms could safely assume that beer and tits would agree well with the audience, too. Duke 3D has got some scandalous stuff in it for 1996. Then, and even more so now, the poor graphics and bright color palette make the truly excessive amounts of sex and violence they've crammed into the game seem mostly harmless, easy to take as a joke. Even as it offended, Duke 3D grins at the player. It is impossible not to grin back. The simplicity of Duke 3D gave it quite a bit of replay value, and this is why people still remember the game so warmly, I think. After you play the game, which is short, there's still a strong pull to go back and investigate everything you missed, to beat the speedrun par times, to find all the secrets, to enjoy the spectacle of goofy carnage a while longer. People who enjoyed Duke 3D got to know most of the levels in a strangely personal way, achieving a feeling of real mastery over the urban labyrinths. There are even space levels as well, offering a little extra variety, and a chance for the level designers to create some truly strange and challenging layouts. Duke Nukem 3D did wonderfully commercially, and Duke Nukem Forever was scheduled to come out a couple years later. It took 12. In the meantime, game design, especially for first-person shooters, experienced radical change. With titles like System Shock 2 and Half-Life, a gun in your hand didn't automatically mean you'd be having a balls-to-the-wall arcade experience, and a desire to tell stories in a more cinematic way became the dominant trend. It wasn't enough for levels to be vaguely connected, they should make sense as a whole. The player should be the focus of the story too, not just the focus of the gameplay. When Deus Ex hit the market, it blew people away by pulling together many of the fragmentary innovations being made in the genre, and creating a game that can be played in multiple ways, both as far as how the player wants to experience the environment and how the player responds to the story. Actually, the very fact that the player could influence the outcome of Deus Ex was revolutionary, at least in the first-person format. In terms of design, it's about as opposite from Duke 3D as you can possibly get. It's wordy, it rewards pacifism, it forces you to scout ahead, to be clever and careful, and if you weren't, you were toast, because Deus Ex is also wickedly difficult, especially by current standards. Deus Ex had such a well-considered design that many people say it still hasn't been topped, Human Revolution be damned. But before we get into that comparison, let's take a look at the elements that Human Revolution wanted to pull from. Let's begin this time with plot. Where Duke Nukem didn't bother, Deus Ex hinges its entire construction around it. It's a cyberpunk thriller about global conspiracies and the corruptions of power, with well-fleshed-out characters who interact not only with you, but with each other as well. Most importantly, though, the game pays attention to what the player is doing and holds them accountable to their actions. A player must grapple with their own moral compass constantly as they explore the world. An early example, about a quarter of the way in, your own brother defects to a terrorist organization you've been tracking. A character has vital information about why your brother might have done such a thing, but you know from an overheard conversation that one of your fellow agents will kill him as soon as you leave the room. What do? Do you just leave? Do you kill your fellow agent and maybe find a piece of the truth? Or would you be killing her only to be lied to more? The game provides no input, does not articulate the choice for the player. The player is absolutely on their own to figure out if deviating from what seems like the intended plot is even possible. The plot and script are quite well done, too, easily as competent as a better episode of The X-Files, and the player is accustomed to games winging it a little on script and plot issues. It seemed like an incredibly smart game. Many people defend it as one of the cleverest ever, but in replaying it for the purposes of making this video, I came to the opinion that it might not be quite as smart as it seems. Much of the dialogue is actually rather awkward and utilitarian, but the characters have a realism to them that's refreshing. To generally hear such well-spoken words coming out of character models that look so very basic makes the dialogue seem better than, in retrospect, it is. What's really groundbreaking about the script is how modular it is, how much it shifts according to player choice, from big choices like the 3 divergent paths in the last level, each leading to a different ending, to tiny details like being chastised for stepping into the women's restroom. Before Deus Ex, players rarely had a game experience that paid so much attention to what they were choosing to do. After Deus Ex, game designers had to live up to a much higher standard of game reactivity. Even more than the story, it's the free-form, player-driven level design that people remember the game as being brilliant for. And it truly, truly is. As you globetrot from facility to facility, you're given a minimum of 2 completely separate paths, oftentimes many more than that. Skill points acquired throughout the game lets you refine the sorts of path you choose. If you don't like hiding and sneaking, you can play the game like a standard, albeit very difficult shooter and put points into weapons. If you like crawling around in vents, you can level up your lockpick. If you like reading people's private emails, you can level up your hacking. Deus Ex lets players perform all of those actions from the very start. They just leave it to the player to determine which ones they get really good at. And when you explore a map thoroughly, you can see how they layered in rewards and special paths for every possible playstyle. Deus Ex has simply the most open-ended solutions of any espionage game I've ever played. The only drawback is that sometimes, while exploring, you accidentally double back on yourself, solving an alternate path in reverse order instead of continuing on the path you'd chosen. It's a minor price to pay for such carefully constructed gameplay, though. Many of the larger city areas are absolutely filled with massive hidden areas, particularly Hong Kong. For example, I never realized until just this last playthrough that I did for making the video that your helicopter pilot has his own hidden apartment that you can visit, provided you found the equally obscure key. Deus Ex is just chock full of secrets that way. Secret societies, secret paths, secret knowledge. The truth-seeking of the game's plot dovetails perfectly with the compulsive exploration that the gameplay encourages. I also want to take a moment and discuss the game's approach to violence. There's not many games that actually try to make the player consider that killing a game character is actually a tiny digital murder. It's true, after all, you are deciding to kill people. You're reminded right from the very beginning, and then with less and less insistence as the game progresses, that you are a peace officer first, and just because you can use lethal force doesn't mean it's correct. It adds a very interesting dimension to the game, if you pay attention. Deus Ex asks you to take the game quite seriously, and if you can get immersed in the game enough to feel guilt over the deaths of the game's characters, you're in the right mindset for having the most fun with the game. I mean, there's a lot to love, but Deus Ex is a very straight-faced game. Being as old as it is, Deus Ex isn't great to look at, but it is wildly ambitious, beautifully designed, and a ton of fun to play. Today, the genres that these games helped pioneer are very well represented. Themes, elements, and ideas from Duke Nukem 3D and Deus Ex are pervasive throughout modern gaming, but it took a very long time for true sequels to either game to arrive. Both games received mediocre follow-up titles, Manhattan Project and Invisible War respectively, but it wasn't until Duke Nukem Forever and Human Revolution that true sequels in gameplay and spirit arrived. Both Human Revolution and Duke Forever had all the tools of modern programming at their disposal to make true follow-ups to these titans of early gaming. But only Human Revolution was successful at it. We're going to examine why. In the 11 years between the original Deus Ex and Human Revolution, the popularization of gaming and the desire for an even larger audience has prompted a lot of developers to think simpler. And comparative to the original game, Human Revolution is simpler, but it's no less clever. Playing the game, I was continually struck by how absolutely the developer was committed to recapturing the fun and the challenge of Deus Ex, while still bolting on a decade's worth of change. The player's abilities and the game's interface are the most immediately noticeable changes, aside from the game being jaw-droppingly gorgeous to look at now. The shift from large, bulky interfaces with submenus behind submenus to something you could rotate through with an Xbox controller has been constant and pervasive in gaming, and Human Revolution benefits quite a bit from it. Abilities are, on the whole, more useful and easier to trigger. To move and interact with the world is effortless and fun, and the world itself has tremendous graphical polish. The locations look wonderful and varied, the architecture and design of everyday objects in the game world are highly stylized and delightful to behold, and the game takes full advantage of many DirectX 11 tricks that make moments in the game feel more alive than anything in Deus Ex. Someone once commented on another video that I had done that, quote, graphics don't have anything to do with immersion. And Human Revolution is a phenomenal counter-argument to that. This game uses a synthesis of artistic design, color scheme, and level architecture to present a world that convinces you of its realness primarily and most effectively through your eyeballs, sometimes in wonderfully subtle ways. It's no slight against the game that it engages with the player in a more visceral and visual way than Deus Ex did. It would only be a problem if they forgot the other things that made Deus Ex such a classic. They most certainly did not. Human Revolution tells a story much better than the original Deus Ex, for instance. Now, a lot of players thought Human Revolution's plot wasn't quite as impressive as Deus Ex's, and there's one context where that is true. Deus Ex was more epic in its scope, drawing you into a truly massive global conspiracy with many big, exciting organizations and concerns, and it kicks into gear very, very quickly. Human Revolution takes a considerably longer time tying the player's personal narrative in with the larger global concerns that dominate the last third of the game, and forces you to interact with characters as friends, colleagues, and competitors before it asks you to see them as VIPs. It's a shift not everyone appreciated, but Human Revolution goes for a techno-noir sort of feel, as opposed to the original game's straight-up cyberpunk style. As such, a quieter, more personal story simply works much better with the tone of the game. And the game feels like a more consistent whole than Deus Ex ever did because of it. A more predictable plot, perhaps, but one that's paced better and functions smoother. Some have also criticized the characters as being too broadly drawn and easy to get, but there's a very good reason for that. Human Revolution features, in addition to the espionage action from which it principally draws, the best hostile conversation system I've ever seen implemented in a game. At key shifts in the game's plot, the player will have to negotiate with a variety of characters who are either violently hostile or malevolently secretive, and the conversation is advanced not by choosing the response the player wants, a la Western role-playing games, but the response the character himself wants to hear. You have to consider, often very carefully, exactly what you know about the character and how they might respond to being pressured in different ways. This is why the characters have personalities and mannerisms you can pick up on so easily. Human Revolution makes it an actual gameplay concern that you pay attention and remember those characterizing details. If a player chooses well, he will advance a few steps toward the other character. If the player chooses poorly, the character will step away from you. I'm unbelievably impressed with how great this is for building tension and making the player feel invested in the story. The system is also very complex from a design standpoint, something that simply could not have been implemented in a believable way in the original game because of that game's technical limitations. It's an example of true innovation that way, an idea that pushes the limits of game technology and blurs the lines between cinema, literature, and gaming. The dialogue is very sharp as well, having excised most of the awkward filler conversations that plagued the first game. But the polish and flash of the game makes that harder to see for the same reason that a player is inclined to be more forgiving of the first game's script. When you see the blocky, simple characters of the first game, you don't really expect anything really meaningful to come out of their mouths, so you're surprised when it does. But Human Revolution bursts at the seams with the amount of money they've put into it, so your expectations for the characters and their dialogue is at a much higher, much more professional level. Slightly less complicated is the level design. While the developers clearly put a lot of effort into making sure you always had at least one optional path, you can't try truly weird strategies for finishing an area to quite the same extent as the original Deus Ex. The same polish and streamlining that makes the game look so good and play so smoothly negatively impacts the game's sandboxy qualities. The game plays as if the programmers outlined all the ways they personally could come up with to get through an area, and shaved off all the possibilities outside of those considerations. And when people criticize Human Revolution as falling short of the original game, this is the biggest complaint. I don't think it's a huge disadvantage. Indeed, having the different paths be essentially telegraphed to the player as opposed to having the player spend a lot of trial and error figuring out a through path helps democratize the game and makes it more accessible to people with less patience and less time. Will it disappoint gamers who want an extremely challenging game experience? Absolutely, yes, and those gamers are very vocal. But I firmly believe that the decreased challenge fixes a lot of pacing issues that I found very off-putting about Deus Ex. Human Revolution may be more linear, but it's a linearity that serves a very legitimate design purpose. The linearity is mostly only noticeable in the closed facility segments of the game anyway. The two urban hubs of Hengsha and Detroit hold just as many, if not more, hidden rewards and obscure paths as Hong Kong and Hell's Kitchen from Deus Ex. Human Revolution also doesn't make quite as big a deal about killing folks as the original game did either, and that's a compromise I felt they could have done without. While you could play Deus Ex all the way through without killing a single person, Human Revolution features unskippable boss fights with powerful opponents who you flat out have to kill, no choice. It trivializes the choice to be a pacifist in the rest of the game too, since it's a hell of a lot harder to play that way, and it's important to keep the player invested in that strategy if they're putting the time into it. Plus, characters won't chastise you for things like, say, murdering 30 police officers. Deus Ex would have flipped you a lot of shit for that, but Human Revolution just quietly sits back and says, well, ammunition for your stun gun is expensive anyway. It's the only time I felt let down by the changes made to the game in the name of streamlining and modernization. I wanted to play through Human Revolution's piece of single-player DLC, the missing link, for this video, but I didn't, and I'd like to say a couple brief words on my one reason why. Over a year after the game's release, it is still $15. The industry standard for DLC, unless it's an outrageously big deal, is $10. Since $10 is what I make in an hour, and I don't really enjoy what I do to get that money, asking me to make pizza for an hour and a half just to play new content that's supposed to make the game's already existing plot more understandable is deeply insulting. I paid $60 for the game, and had a bit of a hard time figuring out the conclusion, and if they simply withheld an important piece of meaningful narrative so they could get $75 of my money instead, well, screw 'em. It's more important to me not to be squeezed like fruit at the supermarket than it is to know what happens in the missing link. And I might have even paid $10 for it, since DLC is a fact of life in modern gaming, but that extra $5 is such an unbelievably cynical move that I won't touch it. But that's a matter of company business policy. As a game, I have quite a bit of respect for Human Revolution. It's one of the best titles of the last couple years, partly because it builds its skeleton on the framework of one of the best games of yesteryear, and partly because of the flesh on top of the skeleton has all the polish that a truly contemporary game can muster. I was watching a clip from the late 90s where a news station was talking about Hollywood-quality special effects in games and showing footage of a kid playing Banjo-Kazooie. It's a really dumb clip, and one that I think of anytime someone says Hollywood quality when referring to games. It's only just now in 2013 that I feel like we're reaching the point where the lines between watching movies and interacting with them in a way that feels plausible is only just beginning to blur. And the way Human Revolution structures its plot, graphics, and gameplay puts it right at the cutting edge of truly cinematic game design. It's what happens when you use the tools of contemporary game design in the right way. Now let's discuss what happens when you use those tools the wrong way. Let's discuss Duke Nukem Forever. Duke Forever failed to live up to expectations so absolutely that people who don't even play games have heard of what an unmitigated disaster it was. My cousin Josh, for instance, doesn't like games and never pays any attention to them at all, but when I casually discussed this video with him and brought up Duke Forever, he immediately asked, "Isn't that supposed to be the worst game that ever was, pretty much?" It pretty much is, but it's bad in a way that I find truly fascinating. You have to understand that Duke Forever came close to being released over half a dozen times, but was scrapped and rebooted over and over again, until the developer Gearbox came in and threw enough money at the project to get it out the door. But they didn't make it a new game, they just took what was already there and made it ready for sale. What was already there was a heap of stale internet references, genuinely miserable level design, and a potpourri of every awful game fad of the past 14 years. The most obvious problem, outside of all the myriad flaws of game design, is how they chose to play off Duke Nukem the character. The game is so fixated on its self-perception as a triumphant return to Duke that it exaggerates the already to-the-max exaggerated qualities of Duke to the point where only a 13-year-old boy could appreciate this version of Duke Nukem. And I mean that from the bottom of my heart. No one, past the age of 13 and outside of the male gender, could possibly tolerate the conveyor belt of alpha male bullshit and expired internet memes that make up the game's script. Where before, what was funny about Duke was the action movie references to movies everyone had seen, not just gamers, and the juxtaposition of clever, semi-realistic level design with fast-paced and hilariously messy gameplay. Duke Forever, on the other hand, bases all of its jokes in passing internet memes, celebrity jokes that I can barely remember the basis for, and references to other games that feel so half-assed I wasn't sure if I was listening to a joke or just witnessing the programmers copy-pasting so they wouldn't have to do any work that day. The tone is just so way off, it's staggering. That's even insulting, because this game thinks that it is so damn funny. I have never played a game more self-congratulatory in my whole life. Duke Forever begins with a shiny, polished version of the final boss fight from Duke 3D, and then it literally pans out to show Duke getting blown by two girls while he plays a video game. When I first got the game, that was the moment when I realized I was going to have to significantly dial back any expectations I had about the experience. The only gag I think was genuinely clever is Duke Forever's excuse for its regenerating health system. It's ego, not health, because bullets don't hurt Duke Nukem, they just make him feel like less of a man.
Yet so right.
Which brings us around to the game's #1 biggest problem, one which is actually a little subtler and more insidious than the game just being aggressively unfunny. Its level design and sequence of levels are totally wrong for a Duke Nukem game, and they're inept on top of it. Where Duke 3D had you blasting through a rapid succession of quick themed levels, each with its own style and aesthetic, so that the frenetic nature of gameplay and the flow of jokes flowed together and carried the player swiftly along with it, Duke Forever is a linear whole, with every level being directly connected by location to the last, and a very limited path from Duke's Casino in Las Vegas to the Hoover Dam. That's it. And each location takes about 3 or 4 times as long as the average Duke 3D level. The goddamn casino is 3 loading screens long and features areas that you have to backtrack through twice, once by foot and once shrunk down to 6 inches tall and riding on an RC car. I am dead serious. That is how they designed the level, and the experience of playing through it is even more tedious than it sounds. And it has a couple levels before combat even begins, where they try to throw in some plot and comedy at the player and establish the setting. But Duke doesn't need that, never needed it, and time spent trying to establish the world of Duke is time the player's patience is being taxed enormously, because the world of Duke is and always has been very stupid. It's only the quick and casual approach to the gameplay that it actually functions as a coherent whole. The RC car segment and the introductory levels are small potatoes compared to a 4-level chain of monster truck driving followed by a huge chain of Hoover Dam crap that you have to do later in the game, which is where I started trying in earnest to figure out how Duke Forever could go totally down the tubes as it did. These segments aren't just bad designed by the standards of 2011, they are bad designed by the standards of 1999. After spending much time with the campaign at all, a sensation creeps through that you're not looking at one bad game on its own. You're looking at a Frankenstein of every unfinished, ill-considered version of Duke Forever they cycled through, sewn together and animated by the mistaken assumption that nostalgia will forgive its sins. The strange thing about Duke Forever is that it was marketed as a game trying to be like Duke Nukem 3D, but the actual title spends all of its energy trying to be every popular game that came out after Duke 3D. and almost the entire history of modern shooters happened after Duke 3D, so it's a pretty jumbled mess of game design choices. System Shock 2 came out. It has a cinematic approach to story as opposed to a level-based episodic one. Gotta put that in the new Duke. Will be cutting edge. Did you see those physics puzzles in Half-Life 2? Can you believe we can do that now? Gotta put that in the new Duke. Say, people really like how Halo limited you to 2 weapons as opposed to a whole tool chest of destruction. Halo sold a lot of copies. Gotta put that in the new Duke. Isn't it neat how Call of Duty lets you fight alongside a bunch of soldiers? That's going in the new Duke. How about those waves of enemies in Gears of War? What a hoot. Stick that straight in the new Duke. Do we still have health kits in this game? No one does it anymore. Put regenerating health in the new Duke. How can people not like it when it's got the signature design cues of every major title of the past dozen years? The way the script is written backs up this way of looking at the game as an amalgamation of passing trends. It relies so heavily on pop culture references picked up glacially through its development. A reference to Batman Begins here, to the first Call of Duty Modern Warfare there, to those weird redubbed G.I. Joe PSA videos further down. Do you remember those? You YouTubed them in 2007. No? Well, Duke Forever would like to remind you how hilarious that you most certainly find them. If some of those elements were hung on the framework of the old Duke, you would have ended up with a passable game. I don't see any way Duke Forever ever would have been a really good game, even if it came out back in '99. But if they hadn't been so totally committed to design schizophrenia, there's plenty of ways this game could have been simply mediocre. As it stands, trying to cram in stale trend after stale trend after stale trend means that once you've accepted one of the game's flaws and are ready to get past it and play ball, you get a brand new gameplay device to infuriate you. It's sadistic. In fact, that is the only word that truly applies to the way Duke Nukem Forever is paced. Sadistically. The levels that are somewhat interesting, all 2 of them, are short, and the levels that are overwhelmingly mediocre stretch on forever. Vehicle segments are not only long, but are infuriatingly miserable to get through due to awful route layout and terrible controls. The jokes are so uniformly terrible that when you do laugh, you feel guilty for caving to the game's sense of self-worth, even a little. Plus, the sexual elements that seem so generally wacky and harmless in the low-resolution world of Duke 3D become actually pretty uncomfortable in Duke Forever's more realistic delivery. There's an alien pregnancy bit that the game plays for laughs, but in actuality is irredeemably misogynistic and awkward. I mean, is this the worst game pretty much ever? Yes, it is. It pretty much is the worst game that ever was, but only because of an approach to game design that is as cynical as it is inept. Duke Nukem Forever is a game that highlights what modern gaming can accomplish by showing how far from the mark it can fall. There you have it. 2 titans of classic gaming, one with a sequel that shows us just how close to cinema a game can truly be if it tries hard enough, and another with a sequel that shows us that trying too hard to be like cinema can result in a disastrous game. For Human Revolution, competency means profitability. It's a great game, it's wonderfully designed, it's sold great, and there will be another Deus Ex. The new Deus Ex will probably be just as good. Duke Nukem Forever, on the other hand, did so poorly, was executed so incompetently, that it may have destroyed the franchise forever, which is a real shame. Both games, in contrast with one another, as well as in contrast with the old games, show how far the industry has come in the 14 years in between Duke Nukem 3D and Duke Nukem Forever. But it also shows the gap in between what a developer can do if they try, and what a developer can do if they hand over all the decisions to the marketing department. Thank you for watching. Budgets, both games had great ambition, so why did one game become so successful where the other game fell so unbelievably short of everyone's expectations? In this video, we're going to be taking a look at why. Let's start with Duke Nukem 3D. It's the 3rd in the series, the first 2 being very early platformers, but Duke 3D was a totally new deal at its release, and its presentation is absolutely peerless. Duke Nukem 3D was the most gleefully violent game yet made when it came out. Doom and Wolfenstein have a sense of humor, but Duke Nukem 3D is a non-stop parade of bullets and jokes until the very end. The plot is pretty much summed up in the game's first line, "You alien bastards are going to pay for shooting up my ride," which seems reasonable, and then you do it. Duke 3D doesn't need a plot, as it has some of the most charismatic level design and memorable art and sound direction in 90s gaming. Years later, when they trot out someone on Fox News to talk about unapologetic violence in games, Duke 3D is still what they're seeing in their mind's eye. When the game came out, this was a big deal. It's easy to forget in a market absolutely saturated in comedy shooters like Bulletstorm that there was a time when this was a subgenre that had to be invented. This game invented it. Let's talk about why the legacy of Duke 3D is felt so strongly even today. First and foremost is level design. Like Doom, Duke 3D's levels were short, about 7 to 15 minutes a pop for casual play, but unlike Doom's sci-fi labyrinths, most Duke levels were real-life inspired places, like a supermarket, a prison, a strip club. Most of the levels had a certain plausibility of art direction to them that made the cartoon violence that erupts throughout seem somehow even wackier. The levels are also filled, in a way I haven't really seen strongly represented in years, with secret areas only accessible through messing with the level, sticking. Hi, I'm Noah Gervais. In this video we're going to be looking at two classic first-person games, Duke Nukem 3D and Deus Ex. We're going to be examining the elements that made these games such classics in the first place, and then we're going to be taking a look at the decade-later sequels that both games got. We're going to be seeing how the modern games stack up against the standards set by the originals, but we'll also be comparing how they are against each other. Human Revolution was a major success that took the skeleton of the original game and built and innovated upon it, but Duke Nukem Forever took what was great about Duke Nukem 3D and just flushed it down the tubes. Both games had big your nose into every nook and compulsively hitting the use key whenever you see something new. The shortness of the levels, the quickness and bloodiness of combat, the potential for hidden rewards everywhere you go. All of it accumulates into a gameplay experience that feels like anything at all could happen and probably would. Duke 3D is a world that feels truly vibrant and clever, a cleverness of construction that makes the stupidity of the player character even more hilarious. Duke Nukem is a terrible, terrible idea for a character that works brilliantly within the context of the game. Duke is the ideal form of every action movie cliché possible, a one-man The Expendables. And that's one of the reasons why he worked so well in Duke 3D. Gaming barely had a history to go back and reference, so almost all the jokes are drawn from either movies or from the game environment. Often they're pretty much perfect. The levels are chock full of great references and awful puns, in addition to having well-considered layouts and through paths. The highly stylized enemy and weapon designs further contribute to the no-top-to-be-over feeling. And there's the beer and tits angle. Old Duke loves himself some beer and some tits, and since women gamers weren't really a thing people considered back in the 90s, 3D Realms could safely assume that beer and tits would agree well with the audience, too. Duke 3D has got some scandalous stuff in it for 1996. Then, and even more so now, the poor graphics and bright color palette make the truly excessive amounts of sex and violence they've crammed into the game seem mostly harmless, easy to take as a joke. Even as a defended, Duke 3D grins at the player. It is impossible not to grin back. The simplicity of Duke 3D gave it quite a bit of replay value, and this is why people still remember the game so warmly, I think. After you play the game, which is short, there's still a strong pull to go